Hey everyone, thanks for coming today. I'm going to be talking about designing Ember apps with functional CSS. So we'll go over what functional CSS means, some packages you can leverage to use it, and show some examples. My name's Jeff, and I work at Tellurium here in London. I'm sure you're familiar with Ember Observer, so if you go and look at your options for using styles in an Ember app, there are at least 100 modules. Things like Sass are very popular. We also have CSS modules, which will scope your styles to a component so that you can not have to worry about global styles or collisions or specificity. There are lots of different preprocessors. There are lots of different ways to write CSS. But it's very challenging. Everything in CSS is global. Collaborating on a large team can be very difficult. You might get assigned a bug or a feature, and you can't be confident that you're not breaking something else in the app when you change CSS. Having a consistent design, having it be maintainable, and even just the developer experience of writing CSS, I think that's why a lot of these tools exist. So if we look at solutions to this problem, one that's been around for a while is BEM. How many people have used BEM before in their styles? Yeah, so basically to avoid the global trap, we've come up with a method where you can very specifically name your CSS classes and not get collisions anymore. And I've used that in a lot of projects, and it works, but you end up with a scalability issue. A more modern approach that I think has come from React and other tool chains is the idea of CSS modules that through the build process in JavaScript, they're scoped to your components. Basically, it'll generate unique class names for you and do some other fun things, but that still has the same scalability and maintainability problem in many cases. That's how you use it specifically in Ember. But the real problem is that this complexity, this global state, it has to live somewhere. So in most of these solutions, we're saying it's going to live in our style sheets, whether it's Sass or less or something else, whether it's CSS styles in JavaScript, we're basically putting it somewhere else. And that can be a big problem over time. So as a reference, I like to point people to this essay that Adam Morse wrote a few years ago. He's a designer and developer, and he used to work at Salesforce. And if you are interested in this, diving deeper into this topic, I really recommend this article. Basically, he talks about reading over the entire CSS code base for Salesforce and the fact that no one had really done that before. You onboard new devs, and no one's going to take the time like, oh, why don't I read through every style sheet we have in the entire tool chain? But a really interesting quote is that refactoring CSS is hard and time-consuming. Deleting unused CSS is hard and time-consuming. And more often than not, it's not work people are excited to do. So what happens? People keep writing more and more CSS. So I'm sure you've seen on your projects that basically over time, you have more CSS. The file's bigger. It's split into more files. It's kind of a disaster. To give you a concrete example, I don't know if you've ever looked at Twitter CSS, but it's 2/3 of a meg. There's 17,000 declarations, almost 10,000 selectors. Somehow there's 1,000 colors. EPUB files for most novels are actually smaller than the CSS bundle. And until recently, that was to display and style 140 characters. So they need more information to describe how to look at 140 characters than most people need to show you a book. So it's a real problem real companies are having dealing with this, which is why I'm proposing to have a look at functional CSS. John Gold also wrote a very short but really interesting article summarizing how it helps your sanity to think of this way. I won't really summarize it, but it's just another thing that I could share a link about. So I'll show some examples and try and explain what functional CSS is. I think this is one of the earlier examples of what BEM could be. Nicole Sullivan took a media object, which an example of that would be in Facebook when you have, say, a profile photo and then someone sharing something, whether it's text block or multimedia. And this is one way you could build that in BEM. And then if you wanted to do that in functional CSS, this is what it would look like. So the concept is that everything is global. You embrace that, and you come up with class names to basically do one thing. So obviously, there aren't actually functions in CSS, but you're thinking of a pure function that doesn't have side effects and is very focused. So MA2 is margin on all sides 2 units. FL is float left. So the idea is you're moving this complexity to your templates, and you're coming up with a design system where instead of having arbitrary pixel values for things like margin and padding, you're coming up with units of measure that will be consistent throughout your whole application. Tachyons is one of my favorite tools for actually using functional CSS. It's very small and easy to use. You can use it in Sass, you can use it with PostCSS, you can just drop the built minified version of it into a project. And that's actually where most of those classes came from in my example. So you don't have to write your own, you can leverage existing tools. This is how tachyons would approach something like a complicated flexbox layout. And this does work really great with Ember through computed properties or class names. You can have these things combined because really it's just a string of class names. The benefits are that it'll work with your existing approaches. Whether you're using BEM or CSS components, you don't have to go all in with functional CSS. It can enhance what you're already doing. I think it's a much simpler mental model. When I've collaborated with designers or back-end devs, using this system has given them a lot more power to be able to get a design 80% there and still work within a consistent design system. Being composable, you think of functions, and it's really obvious what things do when you build these things together. And maintainable in the sense that you're not writing new CSS. The complexity exists in your templates instead. So this is an example of a documentation site for an add-on that I built using almost entirely tachyons. So I realize it's a little minimal, but I feel like, so I recorded a little video of me just kind of scrolling through it to show, I mean, it's a fully responsive site, and I think it's pretty easy to use and to read. And it didn't take that much effort by one person to get something that I think is a nice default or a nice starting point. And this is the entirety of the custom styles that I wrote for it. The rest is just all tachyons. So I realize no one wants to end up in a situation like Bootstrap where every website looks the same. So I guess an argument against using something like tachyons is that you'll end up with the same values. But they do use CSS custom properties through PostCSS, and they've now landed in browsers, so you can customize any of these values really easily. So this is what the template would look like, again, with some of the composable CSS classes. Here's another example where I was able to build a photography portfolio site, basically a gallery. And again, it's something like 90% tachyons. And I think you can get a pretty nice, clean result by using this approach. Who's heard of the Ember map guys before? Has anyone heard of them? Has anyone used Ember Mirage? Okay, so Sam Selikoff, I think is how you pronounce his name. Him and Ryan Toronto, it's a video course, so they're using functional CSS. You can, most of the time you can tell when you inspect a website or app and you start seeing classes like BG dark gray, near white, F6. Those are your functions. Even segment is using CSS functions. And it's interesting to me as a counterexample because it works with their existing approach. So you can see through these class names that they're using some form of CSS modules or components because they're unique generated hashes, basically. But then if you look at the footer, they also seem to have a mix of potentially BEM, but then also MT2, DB. They've got functions in there as well. So it's a nice approach that you can add into what you're already doing, and it makes refactoring a lot easier. Just a couple bonus things to show how I built the add-on site and portfolio, also leveraging other Ember tools. So the documentation site for that add-on, it's actually using the dummy app from the add-on itself, and you can deploy that. So using Ember CLI deploy git, it will actually build the test app in your add-on and then deploy that to your GitHub Pages branch. So if you're working on your own add-ons and you want an easy way to have a documentation site without doing something custom, this works really well. And Prember, I guess is how you pronounce it, it's pre-rendering Ember. So to deal with being able to reload a page, because to get it working on GitHub Pages, you can't take advantage of well, you'd have to use the hash URL, so refreshes wouldn't work. This creates a bunch of index HTML files for you. And then, so again, this is the output. And this is what it would look like using just these functions. For that site and the photography portfolio, I found there's a new, really easy way to get typefaces into your project. Someone's created NPM modules for over 800 fonts that are from Google Fonts and other free sources, and keeps them versioned. Now that you can install things from node modules very easily in Ember CLI, we can detect that and pull that in your project. So basically, in 2 steps, you install this add-on, and you install the typeface you want, and then that's it. You can use it in your project. It makes managing your typefaces a lot easier. You don't have to deal with vendor files and so on. And the other one that I thought was interesting, just briefly talk about, is dealing with EXIF metadata. So the order of the photos and the captions and all of the information about them is actually pulled from their metadata. So at build time, it runs the directory of photos through this add-on, and you can pull out any metadata you'd like about them. Say you wanted to sort by location or category or otherwise. And that's it. Thank you.